Which?
Test.
Testing,
Right.
testing, and no feedback. Fabulous. Well, coming after Vint.
It's a different format, though. We're going to have our own little dueling banjos thing going
Yeah.
here before the real banjo players come up.
That's
At
right.
the end.
Yeah. So, David also kind of, I think, picked up on a lot of what I was planning to say as well, which is that the freedom to connect is not enough in and of itself. You can have free networks, but are the human beings using those networks free? And if the human beings using those networks, even if you have a globally interconnected internet, and even though they have freedom to choose which networks they're using and so on, if the human beings do not have any freedom from harm, as Vint pointed out, and if they do not have freedom from fear, the networks may be free, but the human beings using them are not. And that's what I thought I would talk about today, is the issue of surveillance, particularly, and how it connects to internet freedom, and why freedom to connect in and of itself, on its own, is necessary but not sufficient for internet freedom for humans, as opposed to the networks. So I'm going to begin actually with a pre-internet story that I opened my book with. And in a previous life, before I started playing with the internet, I was a television correspondent based in Beijing. I was working for CNN in the late 90s, and I happened to read a book at the time by a British historian named Timothy Garton Ash. And the book is called The File. And somebody was just remarking, sort of as a joke, "Papers, please." Well, this book is about what happened in East Germany after the wall came down. And people, for the first time, were able to see their Stasi files. And people were able to find out who'd been snitching on them all those years to the Stasi. And not only did people find out in some cases that their colleagues had been informing on them, that neighbors had been informing on them, but in some cases lovers, spouses, children, parents, etc. A very disturbing thing to happen in a society when suddenly this is uncovered. And so Ash kind of tells the story of some people who discovered their own files and what was in them, and also people who decided they didn't want to know. A really chilling story to be reading in Beijing as a foreign correspondent who is subject to a great deal of surveillance on a daily basis, and whose friends are questioned about their relationship with you, and you know that there are people informing on each other. So after reading this book, I happened to go to dinner one night with some Chinese friends, and I told them about this book. And these were pretty sophisticated people, journalists, artists, and people who are fairly worldly. One of the friends put his chopsticks down on the table. We were eating some kind of spicy Sichuan chicken and washing it down with beer. He put his chopsticks down, looks around the table, and says, "One of these days, the same thing's going to happen here in China, and then I'll know who my real friends are." And the table went completely silent for a few beats before we resumed eating our spicy chicken and drinking our Qingdao or Yanjing beer or whatever it was. But what I've come to realize in the ensuing years is that if and when that time happens and political change occurs in China, he may not actually be able to have that same moment of discovery, because the informants are no longer human. They're the networks that he's using. And we saw this actually in a different form or in a different context in Egypt. A couple months after Mubarak stepped down, there was one Saturday afternoon when I was trying to write my book and being distracted by Twitter, as happens. And I happen to follow a lot of Egyptian activists. I saw that people were actually getting into the state security headquarters outside of Cairo, and that the state security agents had left behind quite a number of shredded files, but also a lot of files left intact, and people were going into the headquarters in real time and kind of reporting what they were seeing on Twitter. Some people found their own files. And what was in these files? It wasn't about, so-and-so's neighbor spied on them. It was reams and reams of email exchanges, their cell phone text messages, their Skype chats that they thought had been secure, but turns out were not, and all kinds of other information that had gone across their internet connection that had been captured through their ISP. And one activist who went in there also found a contract that had been sent by a British company, Gamma International, to the Egyptian state security for a deal that they were trying to do to sell deep packet inspection technology to the state security so that the surveillance could be conducted in an even more finely grained way. And we do know that apparently that contract was not executed, but we do know that in Egypt a number of other Western and American technologies are in use, including products by a California-based company now owned by Boeing called Naris, which also supplies some of the technology used by the NSA to spy on us, which we can talk about more later. But that technology is sold all over the Middle East. And so even though you've had a revolution, and Vint talked about, maybe a little too early to chest pound, one of the things about the Egyptian revolution is, of course, that whether Egypt is actually going to evolve into a stable democracy, a vibrant democracy, is not yet clear. And while the internet played a role in bringing down a dictator, what role will it play in enabling this stable democracy to emerge? And we know that this technology that was being used to spy on activists before Mubarak stepped down is still being used by the transitional government. Anybody who thinks it's not is smoking something really good. And so, in other words, activists realize that even if you have a political situation that becomes more free, the networks are still defaulted against them and defaulted in the favor of whoever is controlling the networks. And politically, this becomes even more difficult because you have quite a number of people elected to the transitional government, to the transitional assembly, who actually favor censorship and favor surveillance, for the reasons a lot of democratically elected politicians do, including some, reasons that relate to wanting to enforce conservative values, religious values, and so on. And so there's a big question mark about whether or not, even though Egypt's had this revolution, whether its networks, yes, they may be free in terms of freedom to connect, but will they be free from fear? And so that's just one example. And one can talk about many more, and I wrote about many, and we can talk about more later. But, this is the point, is that globally, if we do want an internet that is free from fear, we need to be able to hold the exercise of power accountable across these networks. I mean, it's technically trivial for companies and governments to collect information. How do we ensure that this relationship, and the information that we're giving up for the sake of convenience and so on, is handled responsibly? And without strong global standards of public transparency and accountability in how information is collected, how law enforcement functions are conducted, how security functions are conducted, particularly at the national level, how these technologies are deployed, that enable surveillance, which are often dual use and you need them for network security and so on. But unless there's accountability in terms of how these technologies are deployed and used around the world, we're not going to have internet freedom. And the empowering potential of the internet will diminish quickly along with the commercial value of it, because if you have a network on which there is no trust and there are high levels of fear, that's not very valuable for all kinds of reasons. And so for different groups of people, I think there are different things that we can do. And I know there are a number of people here in the room and who will be here at the conference who are working on decentralized alternatives, who are working on secure technologies, who are working on the idea of how to run an ISP in such a way that really creates a model for protecting people's information. But we also need to put greater pressure on the large companies to recognize that they have civil liberties responsibility. And if the network is full of fear, if it lacks trust, maybe in the short run that might not matter to the quarterly earnings, but in the long run, it's sort of like the environment. In the short run, if you're polluting, maybe that doesn't matter for your profits, but in the long run, you're sort of destroying the environment, and that's going to be bad for your business because it's going to make everybody sick and it's going to hurt the economy, and it's, et cetera, et cetera. And as over time, businesses have come to recognize that acting in a more sustainable and responsible way towards, when it comes to environment, when it comes to labor standards, in the short run isn't necessarily, it's not clear what it means for profits, but in the long run, it's absolutely part of sustainable economy, sustainable society, sustainable business, and it's all tied together. And businesses, I think some businesses are a little further along in understanding this than others. But this is part of the sustainability of the internet going forward. So businesses working around the world do need to conduct really human rights due diligence, just as they conduct environmental impact assessments on what they're doing. As Vint talked about, businesses need to think about baking security, baking safety, considering how this technology is going to be used not only around Palo Alto or in New Jersey, but how it's going to play out unexpectedly in all kinds of places. And as Vince said and others said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And sometimes a platform or a set of terms of service, perhaps around identity, let's say, or around personal information collection that seem to work just fine in sort of an American context. When you take those terms and sort of norms and you stick them in Syria, people get killed. And so companies have a responsibility to think this through. Companies have a responsibility to push back when governments are making demands that have questionable legality, not only in countries where governments don't often respect their own laws, but in the United States. And so, recently Twitter pushed back against police requests for information about Occupy Wall Street protesters. And we really need to encourage businesses to do this more, because in this country even, a lot of ISPs are not pushing back against very legally questionable requests that they're receiving. We need to promote transparency. Google has a transparency report in which it's reporting on government requests it's getting, both to hand over information and to remove content all around the world. We should expect this and demand this of all companies, of all internet companies, anybody who's handling data. We need much more transparency. And we need governments to be transparent and accountable about how information is being shared and collected. And just coming back again to the United States and the NSA, first of all, when it comes to the sale of the creation and sale of technology that is dual use and can be used for surveillance in addition to network management and whatever, There needs to be much more accountability and transparency about where that's going and how that's being used. Investors need to exercise pressure on companies that are selling this technology that's being used to ultimately kill people. But also, I think the U.S. government has a responsibility to exercise greater pressure on these companies it's buying equipment from. And these companies are also selling the same equipment to extremely nasty governments. There need to be standards for vendors. And we're not seeing anything. You know, this wiretappers ball that happens every year outside of, in the DC suburbs. You have people, representatives from, 35 federal agencies, I think at the last one, plus state and local, mixing it up with representatives from 43 different countries. And very little, basically no pressure from the US government as a consumer of this technology on the makers of this technology to sell it responsibly. We need more pressure. And also, of course, internet freedom starts at home. Government surveillance powers here in the United States need to be held accountable and constrained appropriately. And they are not sufficiently held accountable nor sufficiently constrained. That is up to us as the American people to fix. As voters, we've not done enough. We need to put more pressure politically on the government. This is an election year. It's, as Vint points out, this is the opportunity to really try and get some things fixed, to get the Patriot Act fixed, to get the FISA Amendment Act fixed, to call more attention to warrantless wiretapping by the NSA. Because frankly, if we, the American people, do not insist that our government get this right, that we get this balance of freedom to connect and freedom from fear right, if we can't get that right in the United States, if we cannot figure out to hold power accountable on our own digital networks, it's going to be much more difficult everywhere else. We've got to find a way to live up to the values on which this country was founded and offer a vision in practice of a digital future that's based in civil liberties and that protects them. So thank you very much, and I'll hand it over to our government representative.
Yeah, I want to build a little bit off of what Rebecca had been discussing. This concept of fear and how fear plays into people's ability to actually actualize their rights, and sort of link this notion. David had talked about the notion of the freedom to connect and how that's been borrowed by my boss at the Secretary of State, and talking about our obligations to advance human rights online. And a lot has been done through those speeches, through work at the Human Rights Council, through other events, through work to advance multi-stakeholder internet governance that respects human rights. A lot has been done to sort of advance the notion of internet freedom and to gather international commitment to preserving rights, the exercise of rights online. And then there's a whole other set of activities, which I'm more closely tied to, involved with actualizing that and allowing people to not just be told that they have rights by a government official somewhere, but to be able to actually exercise those in a meaningful way. And so the fear angle is an important angle of that, and one that I think is definitely deserves some exploration. And David, you raised this as well in your initial remarks when you said that I think I wrote it down, when we avoid websites because we are afraid, we are not free. And so it is one thing to actually have physical, technical access to something. It's another thing entirely to be able to do that in an environment where you feel that you have the repercussions of exercising that right aren't so great as to prevent you from self-censoring. So realizing rights online. I mean, in a lot of ways, I happen to come from, again, I'll take issue with a little, one of the, David's introductory points, that nobody in government, nobody in power ever wants to give out rights. I happen to represent one of the elements of the U.S. government, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, that is charged with helping to give out rights. So in a lot of ways, our work to advance human rights online is very similar to work being done offline and the work that's been done for decades around this. It's also different in some very interesting ways. One is that basically this disparity that emerges between rights online and rights offline. And so you can have, for instance, a woman in Saudi Arabia who's more able to express her frustrations in an online space than she is in the public square, or a LGBT teen in Uganda who's better able to connect with people in an online space than they are offline. And this disparity creates some tensions and some opportunities. I think that disparity has been really important. People having the ability to exercise these rights in online spaces has allowed them to sort of spread their wings and push for more rights in other spaces, and we've seen that the impact of that. But it also has led to this backlash that Rebecca outlines, where you have this tension between what can be done in the online and offline world, and you have people who are threatened by an empowered citizenry who are fighting back and who are trying to find ways to manipulate the technology that's out there in order to preserve their way of doing things and the old ways of business. The other interesting thing about advancing rights online is, as Rebecca has made the case here and very ably in other places, is that my ability to actualize my rights online are often determined not just by my government, but by a lot of non-state actors, by the services that I'm on, by the technologies that I have made available to me. And so that creates a situation where folks in this room, the technology vendors in this room, technologists, NGOs, other people in this room, have an ability from afar to engage in activities that can actually help to actualize rights, or can affect people's ability, positively or negatively, to actualize their rights, and to allow somebody, again, that woman in Saudi Arabia, to speak up in an online space in a way that we're often constrained from being able to do in meet space. And so how have we taken advantage of that? Well, the State Department has engaged in a lot of activities around internet freedom. We've done $76 million worth of programming over the last now 4 years. We'll do an additional $25 million in programming in 2012. A lot of that has focused around technology aspects or technological innovations that both allow people to get around censorship, and also that allow people to be doing that safely and securely. And so I think, again, Rebecca was one of the loud voices in this space, but something that we've also recognized within the past few years is that circumvention isn't enough. And I think that when endeavors started in this area, there were a lot of people who were solely focused on getting over firewalls and getting around circumvention, which is an important aspect of empowering people to exercise speech, to connect to information, to connect to each other, but it is only part of the puzzle. And so we have lately been much more focused on secure communications. We've been more focused on anonymous and privacy protecting communications. We've been focused on protecting not just the communications itself, but the security of devices, because of some of the malware, spear phishing, keylogger sorts of threats that Vint referenced in his initial talk. The sort of threats that are keeping people from being able to exercise their rights have evolved very quickly, and it's become a much more complex environment than just simply providing the tool that allows someone to get over the firewall. Apart from the technologies themselves, we've been trying to professionalize the space to provide security and auditing and testing resources to circumvention tool, anti-censorship tool developers and secure communications developers, to make sure that what they're providing is safe, is as effective as possible, is secure. We're looking at a wider range of threats and a wider range of possible solutions. Things like mesh networking, which was referenced earlier, as a way to provide an alternative in those cases where the internet is shut down, where the sort of ultimate form of censorship is disconnecting the entire network. What are the things that can be done in those sorts of environments so that people are ready immediately when it happens to respond in those sorts of situations? The other areas besides the sort of the technology that we're advancing on our side is sort of working with the environment itself, working with technology vendors, working with others to try to get them information about what we're seeing so that they can build safer products and better tools, and to try to at least inform them of, give them the information that they need to make these more considerate decisions about the implications of the technologies that they're building. I do want to address this other aspect of it as well, that governments are better at surveillance and they are better at blocking than they used to be. Certainly, again, as Rebecca has said today and in other places, that's due in large part to technologies, that's being aided certainly by technologies that are being provided to them in the West, and that is something that there is a great deal of concern about. There are a number of different initiatives on both sides of the Atlantic in order to sort of curb the flows of surveillance technology and other sorts of tools to repressive governments. I don't think that the sort of the chasm that Rebecca notes is because of a lack of political will. I think that really a lot of it is that this is a very hard set of issues to crack, and part of the problem is identifying what are the bad technologies, what are the things that we wouldn't want people to have in more repressive environments. It's difficult. There are a very maybe small subset of things that you could really label as these are very bad things, but there's a whole range of technologies, of dual-use technologies, where the same tools that are used in repression are the tools that are necessary to keep the network running, or are and operating and protected, and to allow people to be using those networks in a safe way in those environments. And so one man's intrusion detection system is another man's deep packet inspection. They're often the same sorts of technologies, and it's hard to on a technology by technology basis figure out what are the bad ones. It's also difficult to figure out who are the bad guys in some cases, and I think we've seen the Irans and Syrias and others, it's been easier to take action. It's been easier to restrict the flow of these sorts of tools because there are existing sanctions regimes. There are places that are involved in very pervasive violations of human rights, and so it's an easier call to make. What's more difficult are those places where there's a more insidious attempt by governments to sort of have their cake and eat it too, between benefiting from the economic prosperity, sort of benefits of being in a connected country, but trying to limit some of the things they're seeing in other countries, what they consider to be the destabilizing side of it, and it's difficult to figure out how to get that formula right. And we've seen, as sort of by way of example, in our efforts to get smarter, it often looks like we're going in contradictory areas. Just a few months ago, there was simultaneously, almost within a few weeks, the Gravity EO, which limited technologies that could be provided in Syria and Iran. At the same time that around Nowruz, there was an attempt to open up the communications tools that are made available to citizens of those countries in order and to more actively encourage companies to provide personal communication services that allow people to take advantage of an open connected internet. So it's unsurprising that in many cases companies aren't sure exactly which way they should be going. This is a new set of issues for them to be dealing with as well, and I really did like the analogy of raising a teenager and sort of trying to figure it out as we go along. I think we're all sort of grasping for what are the best solutions. And I think, Rebecca, you also keenly note that while government has a role on this, I think there's general agreement that sanctions alone aren't the answer, and that there's also a limit to the appropriate role of government in controlling these sorts of tools. And at the end of the day, companies need to take responsibility and be more aware of the folks that they're selling to, and understand the implications what they're developing. And there have been initiatives that we can get into that have been more or less successful to engage companies in doing exactly that. A few other things I want to mention briefly. One is the idea of smarter and safer users. That part of it is creating that demand side. More sophisticated users will ask for better technology. More sophisticated consumers and constituents will demand more of their governments and of the companies. It's important for us, in some of the work that we're engaged in, is getting that information to the people who need it most, the bloggers, the digital activists, and others who are in the most repressive environments, to help them to be more aware of the risk they're taking online. But we need to broaden that, and we're beginning efforts, and we're trying to do more to get information out to a broad audience, to do more sort of public health style, broad societal engagement on these issues, so people understand when they're taking unnecessary risks. We've seen in many cases that people who don't necessarily identify themselves as activists all of a sudden engaged in a societal effort that puts them at risk. And so how do we better not just educate the bloggers and activists, but increase, sort of up everybody's game. And then finally, the sense that policy in a lot of ways is the end game here. I mean, while we invest a lot in technological solutions, I think that's a response to the immediate need, and we need to continue to build technologies that bake in security, that more closely tie the economic benefits and the rights-preserving elements. But at the end of the day, this sense of the accountability and rule of law are very important as to how a technology we use in a different society. And so, I guess going back to the ISS World Conference, I was one of the folks who attended one recently, and I don't know that I'll be invited back to another one. But one of the things that I was surprised by in that conference was in the law enforcement sessions, the amount of respect for the process, and that these sorts of tools were built around the legal process, and when in the question and answer, everyone was very keenly aware of what they needed in order to use these sorts of tools, and that may or may not be because of a deep and unwavering respect for human rights, but it's certainly because everyone in that room, all of these law enforcement professionals, had seen some bad guy that they were chasing get off because somebody didn't follow the process somewhere. And so having accountability, having rule of law is the structure around which we can begin to trust the system and begin to never to stop questioning, but begin to have a framework around which we can be more confident and better able to hold people to account who abuse those sorts of systems. So in countries, as Rebecca noted, where those structures don't even exist, there's no basis to believe that these sorts of tools won't be abused. And so I think that policy side is important. I think I was in an event with Sasha a few weeks ago where he talked about the importance of having geeks in government. Well, we don't have enough geeks in our own government. Governments in these sorts of societies, there are very few policymakers and very few government officials who really get it. We need to be doing more to train those people up and understand what the issues are. I think ISOC's been doing some great work in that front, but there's more that can be done. And then, again, finally getting civil society represented in those sorts of multi-stakeholder internet governance, both at the national level and global level, and influencing policies and corporate policies as well. So with that, I will quit my comments and we can take some questions.
Yeah, we'll take some questions. Just one quick note about process by U.S. law enforcement. I just do need to point out that the ACLU recently came out with a big report in which they documented the widespread lack of process by law enforcement around the country in conducting surveillance, electronic surveillance. So we still have a lot of reasons why kind of trust is very weak within our own networks that we've got to work on. But
yeah, I won't suggest that we've solved all of these problems in the U.S., but
yeah, we need more geeks in Congress too, clearly. So I think we have about 10 minutes or 9 minutes and 42 seconds for 40 seconds for discussion.
There are two Q&A mics. Yep. Say your name and your brief question.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Rebecca. Wonderful presentation. My name is Kathy Kleiman. Is the mic on? Great. And what I wanted to do, actually, rather than ask a question, is share quickly a story that I think reaffirms what both of you were saying. Years ago, when I was first starting out, I met an early general counsel of AT&T. Right after law school, before he went to business, he became a trial lawyer at Nuremberg. That was his first job. And when he became, and he told the story years later, that when he went to AT&T, the U.S. government showed him that you could wiretap the telephone lines using alligator clips. And he realized there was a problem, and he realized there was danger. He took things away from what he had learned at Nuremberg. And he pushed for legislation that would limit and constrain how the government could use this surveillance technology and create mechanisms for review, accountability, and appeal. He said this was going to be the basis for creating trust in the telephone network. I think we're at a similar decision point here, and we need similar responsibility being exercised, and we need similar legislation and similar thought. But we're not the first to think about it, and we're not the first to do it. Thank you.
Absolutely true.
Yeah, and just to echo that, I mean, not to echo, but to one point to sort of draw off of that is the mobile space itself is even more of a morass in a lot of ways than the traditional landline or traditional internet space. And I think that's an area that deserves a lot of focus in coming years.
Well, especially given that mobile internet is, where most of the internet is going to be happening from here on out, particularly in the developing world, particularly in countries with weak rule of law, et cetera.
So it's Vince Cerf again. One point, we aren't going to have an internet at all if we don't implement IPv6. So I want everybody in the room to go beat up on your ISPs and tell them that June 6th is IPv6 World Launch Day. So pay attention to that. Second, there is a problem when you talk about dual-use technologies and how some of them can be abused, especially deep packet inspection and other kinds of analytical tools. Here's the problem. You sell to a legitimate target, and the legitimate target turns around and resells to somebody else, and sometimes that's very hard to detect. So even if we have a lot of rules and OFAC gets involved and everything else, we do run into the problem of not being able to detect that there has been a resale. And of course, you set up false companies and all kinds of things. So I don't know if you want to react to that, but it's not an easy thing for you to enforce.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And although there's actually Blue Coat, which is a California-based company whose technology turned up in Syria in violation of sanctions, their devices were actually pinging home. Now, they claim that they weren't actually paying attention or they didn't notice and so on, but I understand they're still under investigation by the Department of Commerce. But it really is hard. And this is one of the reasons why the Global Online Freedom Act, which has been kicking around for many years now in Congress in different guises, is struggling to sort of get to the point where it can really work. Because part of it, there's a lot of different parts of it, and we won't go into all the different parts, but one part of it has to do with export controls on technology that can be used for surveillance. But it gets into this whole question of, are you actually going to be making it harder for independent NGOs in different countries to carry out network security if you get to, and then also, there are just so many different problems that you run into, and how do you regulate it, which is one reason why the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I would really recommend people interested in this issue, they came out recently with a white paper of recommendations for companies that sell this, that manufacture and sell this type of equipment that is both for security and can also be used in bad ways. Just having a know your customer and sort of transparency regime. Because they recognize that this is going to be really tough to regulate in a really hard way, but there are a lot of other ways that relate to reporting and accountability and tracking. And in other industries, when it comes to sort of supply chain, so like in manufacturing, there are all these issues with, how do you make sure your supply chain is clean and that there's not somebody somewhere in the chain who's employing 6-year-olds, and there are some approaches for how you kind of track where things are going, and that there could be a lot more done, and the industry and investors haven't stepped up either, and investors have been putting a lot of pressure on companies for labor and environment and so on, they're only starting to wake up to this issue, but as they get educated on this issue, I think the pressure from the socially responsible investment community, which is a growing percentage of funds in the United States, is going to really grow as well.
I have a question for Ian, but it looked like you wanted to respond to something else.
Well, just a few things. One, I think, Vin, you'll be happy to know that I was reading one of my reports from a grantee over the weekend, and they were talking all about their efforts to upgrade one of the circumvention tools to be IPv6 compliant, and so for a very popular tool. The other thing I just wanted to add to what Rebecca was saying on the company side, I mean, yes, Blue Coat may or may not have thought to check to see if things were pinging home, but it in some ways, it's sort of abusing your analogy. It sort of takes a village to raise a child. You know, there are companies are beginning to talk to each other more about these sorts of things and realize that they have a responsibility to think about the rights implications of the things they do. Global Network Initiative is a good example of that, and getting more companies to become aware that this is something that they need to think about and have a support network of other parents. The sort of the PTA, if you will, in the room that is an important part of beginning to get companies to begin to take this more seriously.
So the question for you, Ian, this is a politically incorrect question. I have enormous respect for Secretary Clinton. Her speeches about internet have been stunningly powerful and evocative. I hope you had a role to play in writing some of that. But the disparity between what's going on domestically with DHS, for example, and what Secretary Clinton is saying felt very, sort of cognitively dissonant. And I wondered whether so is there an interagency process that's just fraught with tension at this point? And you may not want to answer that question, but I spent a lot of time with both the State Department and with the DHS, and my sense is that the DHS doesn't make the laws, they're required to enforce them. And so we do have a problem. We can argue about the practices, but I have the feeling that our voices need to be heard on the legislative side even more than anything else. But what's your sense of the
I think that's
there?
absolutely true. You might be surprised to hear that there isn't an interagency process, but there are a whole lot of different interagency processes around particular issues or particular pieces of legislation as they come up. And state does have a role in weighing in on those as well. And so, by way of example, the state was one of the agencies was most involved in determining the administration's position on SOPA and PIPA that eventually was posted on the White House website. And I think that DRL's equities in that and the importance of our global efforts at promoting internet freedom were very highly considered in developing that administration position. There are other areas where, I think in my experience, and I don't get involved in those as many of my colleagues do. I tend to be more focused on the programmatic work. But in my experience, it's actually sort of a mixed bag. As far as you never know who your allies are going to be and who your enemies are going to be going into these. Allies are even sort of the wrong terms, but you never know. Sometimes the reaffirming voice that you're getting around these tables is coming from not the place that you expect it to be. And in particular, I do think that the law enforcement community and sort of the rights community, while they don't always see eye to eye on things, the end goal. There's a lot of room for discussion there. I think that there are other communities that that are more focused in their goals that are sometimes not as conversant, that are harder to engage in some of these kinds of things. But it generates a lot of discussion. I think that there is an importance throughout the administration in recognizing that internet freedom is important and protection of rights is important. And it's an area where we've been able to get a lot more currency on human rights issues than in a lot of other spaces. And so I do think that it's something that is taken seriously.
Well, let's thank Ian and Rebecca for a very informative 45 minutes. And let's turn our attention to Kathy and Marcy, who will take us out to the break.
We're going to change the mood just a little bit with some Django ran hard on the nuclear